Hey, everybody, welcome to the Rooftop Leadership Podcast. Tonight, we're going to be talking about beautiful questions. We're going to be talking about beautiful questions that can lead us through times of uncertainty. And one of the first times that I saw how a question could serve in a leadership position was in one of the most dangerous places on earth. It was in northern Kandahar, Afghanistan, in January 2010. And we were implementing a program called Village Stability Operations. And this program was designed to put Green Berets and other special operations leaders back out in the remote rural villages of Pashtun, Afghanistan. After 10 years of enemy-focused activities, we were getting back to our roots of living and working by, with, and through indigenous people. And particularly these Afghan tribal folk really offered the best chance of defeating the Taliban and, more importantly, stabilizing Afghanistan with solutions that were really appropriate to their culture and not necessarily our liberal democracy. And it took us a decade to learn that, but we did learn it. And now in 2010, we were busily working in multiple villages to try to live there, embed there, and then work with local Afghans to find ways for them to stand up on their own. And it was working pretty well, except in one particular village in northern Afghanistan, where the elders had gone through a very, very rough time since the 1970s. They had gone through a Soviet invasion that was extremely brutal, followed by a civil war that killed over 1 million Afghans and displaced 7 million more. And then the invasion of the United States and the Allied coalition following 9/11. So when you add all that up, it's like 4 decades of nonstop war. And so in this particular village, the elders had gone through a lot. Most of them had been killed. Many of them had lost their children. Many of them had seen their villages decimated by targeting operations, and they had just lost their patience, really, for anything from the outside. They had no interest in anything we had to say or any external opinions or anything else. They were very isolated, very secluded. But this village was critical. We needed this village as a waypoint on its way up to the Taliban sanctuary that we needed to disrupt. And also, just in Afghan trade, this village was critical to national stability. So we put a lot of effort into working and trying to find ways to persuade or influence Afghan locals to allow us to live in that community and work with them. But they'd been through a lot, and everything that came out of our mouth was pushed back. And I look back on it now, and I realize that we were doing way more talking than we were listening. We were simply projecting these different ideas of how this would work, and how about if we try this, and they weren't having it. It was in one afternoon, though, that I was sitting under a big mulberry tree with a couple of Spingiri, what it's a Pashto word for whitebeards, and they were particularly hard to deal with. They were hard, they didn't even really want to talk to me very much. But with this program, I was adamant about trying to get their perspective even a little bit. So after some frustrating attempts, I finally backed up and I said, would it be okay if I asked you a question? And a little bit annoyed, he said, fine, what is it? And I said, what was life like here before the Soviets came in this village? What was it like before the Americans, before the Civil War, before the Soviets came here? What was this village like? And it was almost like he looked at me as if like he were in a bit of shock. And I could tell it moved him a little bit. I could tell that it kind of threw him off his center. His guard really just came down, and his eyes kind of misted over, and he just got a smile in the corner of his mouth, as did the other elders that were sitting there. And they just sat there in that question for a minute. And I could tell that they were transported. They were in a different place. And he just kind of didn't even really make eye contact with me. He said, I'll tell you what it was like. And he proceeded to share with me what a day in the life was like in the village of Cokrez before 4 decades of war started. He talked about the Blue Mosque that was right up the hill, and how on every Friday, the holy day, families would go up and have picnics on the grass, and something that in this day and age you wouldn't even think about doing for fear of a Taliban attack or an IED or collateral damage. And he just started to talk about how the bazaar was thriving and you could hear children laughing in the streets. And now you don't hear children anywhere. In fact, all of the young people have gone to Pakistan. And he just reminisced about, and he talked about how the elders really handled most of the situations. They handled the disputes, and how communities handled their own affairs. They didn't need government intervention, and how they had their own way of cleaning their own streets. They had their own way of food security. You know, their own agricultural practices that managed the herds and the timber. And they didn't need government interventions. It was all handled at a local tribal level. And I sat there in awe of myself, as I listened to him basically lay out every single solution that needed to happen in this community. And it really came from a perspective that he hadn't been asked. In 10 years of warfare, no one had ever asked him this question. And he told me that. He's like, no one has ever asked me that. And interestingly enough, it opened up. I just kept asking follow-up questions, and we kept talking. And really, in pretty short order, that old man and I got pretty connected. Whereas before, there was no connection at all. And we didn't talk about Taliban. We didn't talk about policy or democracy. We just talked about what life was like before the violence. And in that, I got such an element of wisdom and such an element of insight, but there was also a connection that was visceral and deep, and that allowed us to, I think over time we got into that village, and it was a very successful program. And he continued to be a sage ally, imparting his wisdom on how we could do this. And it really brought home for me the power of questions. And I never really, that was instinct. I never really got my head around the skill of that and what it takes to really be good at questions until recently. And it's an exciting thing for me to tell you that tonight you're going to get to meet the man who really turned me on to the science of questions and to the immense potential that questions represent to us as leaders. Because here's the thing, before I introduce him, I've got to tell you this. In that village that we were operating in, there's what I call the churn. There was disengagement, a lack of purpose. There was distraction, and there's distrust. And I don't think there's anything unique about those realities with you and me today. I think we're facing those same things. As my guest calls it, he uses the VUCA acronym, volatility, uncertainty. He talks about complexity and ambiguity, but it's those conditions of just that churn that more than ever we're facing today. And how do we lead through that? How do we lead our clients through that? How do we lead our associates? How do we lead our families, our children, and our communities through these very uncertain times? And I've come to believe that questions are a big, big part of that for us, a big part of the solution, but not many people are doing it. And so tonight, I am absolutely thrilled to bring on a gentleman who I've just admired for really a long time, since I've read his book, studied his work, and he was kind enough to come on tonight to our video podcast to talk with you about questions. And it is Warren Berger. He is the author of the book of Beautiful Questions. He is also the author of A More Beautiful Question, and he is a questionologist. And what I love about him is he has studied hundreds of thought leaders and industry leaders, high performers, to figure out, how do they ask questions? How do these leaders that we admire, these influencers, how do they generate original ideas? And then how do they solve problems? And his stuff has appeared in Fast Company, the Harvard Business Review, and the New York Times. So we're very, very blessed to have him with us tonight. And for the rest of the hour, Warren and I are going to chat about how beautiful questions can lead us through uncertainty. So Warren, thank you so much for being here tonight, sir.
Great, Scott. Thank you. It's good to be here. And I really enjoyed your story. And I hear stories like that a lot about how, people are kind of stuck and not getting anywhere. and the thing that suddenly unsticks everything is questioning. And it's just this amazing tool that, for some reason is very underappreciated. That's one of the things I try to figure out in my work. Why is it so underappreciated? And why is it this tool that we kind of have from the time we're children, but we're not really maximizing it. In fact, we're often doing the opposite. We're often resisting it. We're saying it's not a good thing and don't ask so many questions, and we're kind of pushing it down when instead we should be using it more. So
Yeah, you're so right. And I was just thinking, my son Braden is just off camera here with my wife, and Braden is a senior. And I've caught myself oftentimes, he'll ask questions, really thoughtful questions, and I'll dismiss them. And the gold that's in those questions when he asks them, and the opportunities for connection are missed when I do that. And it's just, I think we do it all the time. I'd like to explore that more deeply, Warren. Before we do, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came to, how did you arrive at the interest and fascination with questions?
it happened over time. I was a journalist for a long time. Newspaper, started out as a newspaper journalist, then became a magazine writer. And so in a way, questioning was part of my daily work. It was a tool of the trade. And I always thought it was interesting because I would spend a lot of time on my questions before I did an interview. I'd really sort of work on them and think about them. And it made such a huge difference, in the interviews I'd have. And yet, one of the things that occurred to me was, when I would think back on going to journalism school, and I went to journalism school at Syracuse University, and they have a very good journalism program there. But there was never any class on questioning. There was never any formal education on sort of the art of asking good questions, or how to ask a good question, how to frame a question. And it just is fascinating to me that here is a profession that revolves around questions, and yet even there, it's underappreciated to the point where it's not taught. It's not taught by anyone. So so that's kind of set the seeds for me thinking, gee, how come even journalists don't appreciate questioning as much as they should, let alone everybody else? And then at one point, I started in my writing and my work, I started to focus on innovation and creativity. So I would profile a lot of, business leaders and innovators and people who tech people who had come up with a brilliant new idea, brilliant new company. And I found as I interviewed these people that questioning was a big, big part of their lives too. So suddenly I had this other connection. I'm thinking, well, it's not just important to me as a journalist. I'm discovering now that innovators and creative artists are also, their work seems to revolve around questions. I mean, they seem to search for the question that they can pursue. And if they can find the right question and then answer it, that unlocks huge success for them. So this was kind of an eye-opening thing. And then of course I started to think about, well, you also have scientists, scientists' work revolves around questioning. So it just started to occur to me that this wasn't just a journalist thing. This was a much bigger skill that had to do with finding new solutions, finding ideas, and the fact that a lot of it started with asking the right questions. So at that point, I really kind of zoomed in on it, and I wrote my first book about it, which is going back about 6 or 7 years now. But I wrote a book called A More Beautiful Question. And that really kind of, got me deep into this thing. So like for the last 7 years now, I've been, as I say, a questionologist. It's kind of a made up term, but the reason I even dubbed that term was, again, going back to this idea that this is an area that really ought to be studied more than it is. So we
Right.
ought to have people who are known as questionologists. We really ought to have specialists in it, and yet we don't. I think every company should have a person there who's sort of the questioner in chief. I think every organization should have it, and the people themselves should be trained on questioning. So I think that this idea that there ought to be this thing called questionology, the study of questions, to me is a big idea, and it's something I promote at universities, and I promote it at companies and wherever I go.
Well, I can tell you, first of all, I appreciate the backstory, and you definitely have a proponent right here that is advocating questionology and becoming a questionologist in the special operations world. I'm
Mm,
advocating it in the law enforcement world, and frankly,
right.
in the corporate circles that I operate, where I teach human connection to people, what I call rooftop leadership, Warren,
Yeah.
which is inspiring people to climb up on those rooftops and take a stand because they choose to do so. And I think
Right.
questions really inspire people to take action that they otherwise wouldn't take. And I'd love to hear from you. Like, so when you thought about, you could have called the question anything. You could have, I've seen power questions and great, but what spurred you to choose beautiful questions? And then what about questions? What's the reward? What's the thing that someone watching this right now could grasp why questions are so important to us for engagements?
Okay, well, first I'll start with the beautiful questions idea.
Okay.
That came out of when I was first digging deep into the subject. Um, I initially was talking to a brilliant guy who was a designer who
Hmm.
designed all kinds of amazing things. And his name is Bruce Mao. And Bruce had a philosophy around questioning, and he used to use, he did use the term stupid questions. And he used to say, the key to being successful is being willing to ask the stupid questions, the questions that everyone else thinks are too fundamental or too naive or too basic. If you are the one who's willing to sometimes step back and ask those questions, it gives you a big advantage. And so I thought that was really interesting. And for a while, I was playing with the idea of talking about stupid questions. But then, it wasn't inspiring enough, So I was looking for something that had a higher feeling to it and would inspire people more. And so I kind of moved from the idea of being willing to ask a stupid question to being willing to ask a beautiful question. I got the idea originally for beautiful questions out of a line from a poem by E. E. Cummings, the poet. And he just had a line in one of his poems where he said, "Always the beautiful answer who asks a more beautiful question." And
Uh-huh.
I really like that line. I saw that phrase, "a more beautiful question." I thought, I could just take that off of this poem and I've got my title, got my title
Wow.
to the book. And, but then once I did that, once I decided that was the title to my book, I had to figure out, okay, well, what do I mean by a beautiful question? If I'm going to be talking about beautiful
Yeah.
questions, how am I going to define that? And, one of the things I say is that that's a very subjective term. Okay, so my idea of a beautiful question might be different from somebody else's, but I came up with my own kind of guideline or definition. I thought of a beautiful question as one that is very ambitious, but not too ambitious. So ambitious and yet actionable, okay? And that has the potential to bring about change. So there's three parts to that. Part one is ambitious, part two, actionable, part three, potentially game changing, potentially world changing, potentially business changing. You get those three elements together, to me, that's a beautiful question. Um, why do you need a beautiful question that's actionable? Well, because if you ask beautiful questions that you can't really act on, those are more like philosophical questions, or they might be spiritual questions, or they might be questions where you're just musing about something like, wouldn't it be great if we could create world peace starting tomorrow? But that's not an easy question to act on. you know. So
Yeah.
I tend to gravitate towards questions that are ambitious. They want to do something big, but they're in that sweet spot that you could actually start to work on that question. And there's things you might be able to start doing to bring it about. So that's how I defined that. And where is the value of that for people? I think if you can identify your own beautiful questions, you've got something to shoot for. You've got something to work on. You've got something to pursue. Now, you could just as easily say, well, why don't you just come up with your own beautiful statements or beautiful resolutions? So why don't you say, I'm going to improve my community, my local community. I'm going to make it a better place. Yeah, you could say that, but it's not quite as effective as asking the question, how might I improve my community? How might I make it a better place? When you switch
Yeah.
the statement or the New Year's resolution to a question, it's much more empowering. It triggers your imagination. A question is like a puzzle that our mind will go to work on. Sometimes it'll even do it unconsciously or subconsciously. It'll work on these questions when we're asleep. So
Yeah.
there's a power in questions that statements don't have. They're somehow more engaging, they're more open-ended, there's possibility there, there's a puzzle there that has to be figured out. And I think it's just a really powerful force, the question itself. So again, if people can identify those beautiful questions for their organizations, their companies,
Yeah.
or themselves, it could be it could
Yep.
be a how might I question, or it
Yep.
could be a how
Right.
might we question.
Sure.
If you can identify that, you've got something really powerful to aim toward.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to go a little bit deeper on that because I was thinking about the story that I started with the elder in the northern Kandahar village. And, the question that I asked him, I look back on it now and, what was it like before the Soviets came?
Yeah.
And, that was a fairly ambitious question
Yes.
because he had never been asked that.
Right.
And it really probed pretty deeply. And there was some risk in that question.
Yeah.
you know it was actionable in the sense that from his answers or from his response were answers that frankly were game changing.
Yeah.
In fact,
Exactly.
this is kind of irony, but the name of my book that I wrote about this was Game Changers.
Right.
And but it really did stem from that question. And the other thing I think
Well, I'll say
about,
this, I
Warren,
want to cut in there, Scott, with one point to make, which is that
yeah,
you could even make the case that that question you asked came out of a question you asked yourself before that, and you might not have even articulated it. But I
wow,
think the question you asked yourself before that was, how might I unlock something with these people? How
mm,
might I get them? How can I get these people to open up? And that was the beautiful question that even if you didn't articulate it, you were thinking it. And that was the question that led you to that interaction with that person. And you sort of said, and that was a beautiful question because that's ambitious. It's actionable,
yeah.
and it has the potential to bring about change.
Is it
So
safe to, yeah, is it safe to say, Warren, that in the application of the term beautiful question, is it safe to say that those are the questions we ask ourselves? or are beautiful questions, is there eligibility also for the questions we ask others? How would
I
you
think it's both.
characterize that?
It's
Okay.
both, but I do separate them. I do tend to
Yeah.
separate them because they're often two different types of questions. Um, there's a big difference between the questions we ask ourselves and the questions we ask others. Um, I often think we have to start with the questions we ask ourselves,
Yeah.
and they will lead us to ask better questions of others. But we kind of have to figure, sometimes we have to figure things out for ourselves. We have to figure out, what is it we're trying to do? What are we trying to achieve here? And who are we talking to, and what's their situation? What's their world like? We kind of have to ask those questions of ourselves first, and that is going to help us to ask better questions when we're face to face with with somebody else.
Yeah, that's so good. And is it also is it fair to say also, Warren, that because honestly, that was, I happened upon that question. I'm glad I did, but it was more instinct than
Yeah,
skill. Is it
right.
safe to say that the more we work at our questionology, the more cognizant we become of those questions we ask ourselves, and then the more open we are to find those beautiful questions that we ask other people? In other words, we raise our awareness levels
Yeah.
to the power of the question we ask ourselves.
Well, that's what I believe. I don't know that it's scientifically proven, but I believe that we have the power, if we ask ourselves questions, to change our behavior, change the
Yeah.
world around us. And you could say that we might ask those questions anyway. We might do it by instinct, and sometimes we would. Sometimes we get lucky and we ask a great question just by instinct or just kind of naturally. But if we turn it into a process, then we don't have to rely on luck, and then it's going to be like, if it's a process and we're thinking about questions and we're almost conditioning ourselves to ask more questions, then we're going to get lucky a lot more often. We're going to ask more questions, so we're going to ask better questions. We're going to happen upon better questions because we're asking more. We're going to start to learn from experience what kind of questions get a good result and what kind don't. And that's going to make us a better questioner. Just the experience of that, saying, I asked this kind of question before and the person kind of shut down. Maybe I should try phrasing it a different way. And then you get a good result. Now now you have knowledge. Okay, next time, that's how I'm going to ask the question. So the more we turn it into a process and a practice, the better we're going to get at it.
Yeah.
It's not as if there are a lot of hard and fast formulas and rules about how to construct a great question. There are a few things you can do. There are a few, and I can share some with you as we talk. There are a few tools and tips,
Sure.
but a lot of it is instinct, and a lot of it is about honing your instincts. The more you do it, the more you become a questioner, the better you're going to be at it.
Yeah. I want to get into because I know you can take us there. I want to get into this essence of why we don't ask more questions, and then I want to pivot into maybe even some of the myths surrounding, why people don't ask questions. But before we do, there's one other observation I wanted to make to you, and I want to get your thoughts on it, because you do talk about this in the book as well. You talk about the benefits of asking questions. But my personal experience, Warren, has been in working across multiple industries and as a former Green Beret, is that when I asked, beautiful questions, when I asked thoughtful, open-ended questions, that where I was really curious and I really wanted to discover what was going on, I saw a couple of things. One, there was usually an enhanced connection between the other party and myself pretty quick. There usually was some level of reciprocity that came from that question without even making a statement. Like, it was a series of questions, some follow-ups, where 2/3 of the engagement was like asking questions, but yet there was this palpable level of reciprocity that you could just feel the connection getting stronger, I felt like I had a higher level of attunement to the other party, the pictures in their heads. I had a better, and I felt like I really had levels of gold for when I did talk, that I could even repurpose things they said into my narrative.
Right.
And those are just like consistently 4 things that I found, regardless of the audience that I'm speaking to. And then the other thing I'll say is, it felt like emotional temperatures of both parties always came down
Yeah.
to a really nice level. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on that, and your perspective on, do you experience the same kind of things, or could you share some thoughts on that?
Definitely. Well, it's a complex issue, because it's mostly true what you're talking about, but not always. So it's mostly true, because when we ask people questions, if we're doing it the right way, that's the big if. If we're doing it the right way, then what we're doing is we're showing respect and we're showing interest. And that definitely opens people up. I mean, it's been shown to be one of the fastest ways to build trust. When you have to build trust instantly, the people who use questioning, for instance, are hostage negotiators use questions, right? Suicide hotline people are taught to use questioning. The reason is that it's kind of an instant bridge you can build with the other person. And the reason for that is because there's trust involved. You're opening yourself up. You're asking them to open up. You're showing respect, and you're showing interest. You're showing curiosity. Now, where it can go wrong is if you're not doing those things. So if you're not showing respect, you're not showing genuine curiosity, you can still be asking what is technically a question, but it doesn't have the same effect. Like, for instance, when you ask someone a question, you can ask a question that has a judgmental tone to it, and you might not even realize it. When you can go to someone and say, why are you doing it that way? Why are you doing things the way you're doing them? What that will do is put the other person on the defensive right away, because they will sense that within that question, there is some kind of a judgment or some kind of an attack. And so you have to be careful to ask questions, particularly in a sensitive situation. If you're in possibly an adversarial situation, you have to be really careful to ask questions that are rooted in curiosity, that have no judgment, right? They're not about telling people what to do in the form of a question. They're about curiosity. They're about exploring. They're about trying to get the other person to open up and share. And if you can do that, that's a really effective way to, as you say, lower the temperature, create a bond, and so that's kind of, that's kind of the key there. We have to think about that, whether our questions are curious. Sometimes there are little tricks you can do. Like, if you want to make sure the person understands that your question is rooted in curiosity, what's the easiest way to do that? Well, it's pretty obvious, right? You would start your question by saying something like, I'm curious about something, or, I was wondering something. And then you go ahead and ask your question. It kind of softens it. It tells them the question is coming from the right place. And it even kind of prepares them for a couple of seconds to know that a question is coming at them. You do have to be aware that, a question is sometimes seen as a challenge. And that's why it's so important to, frame your questions properly. I sometimes go even further. Not only do I use that phrase, that softening phrase at the beginning, like, I was wondering, I'm curious about something, or it could be, can I ask you something? You use those kind of softening phrases at the beginning, but you can also use the same kind of thing at the end of the question, after you've asked it. And that is you share the rationale, the reason you asked the question. So you say, I was wondering something, Scott. I was wondering why you happen to take this approach that you use. And then when I'm done asking the question, I say, and the reason I asked you that is because I'm dealing with the same situation myself, and I thought maybe it would help me. So now what I've done is not only have I showed you the question is coming from curiosity, but I've shared with you the rationale that I have a reason why I'm asking you. You know, it's important and it could help me, and you know, there's all good stuff behind this question.
Is there any benefit, Warren, in that situation with possibly moving the rationale to the front of the question so that
Yeah,
they
you
know
could do it
right
that way
away?
too. Absolutely, you could do it either way. I find that I like the balance of having the kind of I'm curious part at the beginning and then a deeper rationale at the end. So
Okay.
the first part is just saying, hey, I'm curious. And
Yeah.
then the latter part is saying, there's a even deeper reason why I'm asking you this question. It has to do with, you know, there's something important that you can share with me that could have a big benefit.
I
And
love that.
that's why I'm asking you this question.
I love it. Well, let's get into this is the part that you and I alluded to earlier is it. So I think we've made a pretty compelling case, and I know you sure do in your book for, you know, why questions they work so well. They like your quote was they're one of the fastest ways to build trust. We are in unprecedented times right now.
Yeah.
From social unrest to pandemics and a range of other challenges that were already in play, you know, before any of that happened. So with all that in mind, it seems like we're listening even less to each other, asking less questions now. Why this aversion to questions if they're this timeless tool that are available to us, and why don't we do it?
Well, I think there's a few reasons why. Part of it has to do with conditioning from the time we're kids, which I'll come to in a second. I also think part of it is there's a feeling we get that feels good sometimes when we get to show people how smart we are, right? And when and we tend to do that with statements and opinions and advice, and so when we're doing that, we feel in control. This is what I believe. I'm telling you what I believe. I think I'm right. And there's a control to that. There's a feeling of power to that. And people get kind of addicted to that. And I think as a society, we've gotten very addicted to expressing opinions. And we get addicted to hearing other people confirm our opinions. That's why we're all going into our own bubbles, political bubbles or whatever, where all we're going to hear is somebody telling us that we're right. Yep, that's what you think, and yes, you're right. So that something about that feels good and empowering, and we've gotten a little hooked on it like a drug. That's my opinion. And we need to wean ourselves off it because it's not a good drug. What it does is it shuts down learning, and it shuts down understanding, and it shuts down broadening, the ability to broaden your thinking and broaden your attitudes. And that all gets shut down by this attitude, this sort of narrow attitude that says, gee, I just want to think what I think and express my opinions, and I just want to hear back similar stuff. So so we need to figure out how to get people to move away from that drug. And I don't know what the answer to that is, because I guess it feels pretty good. But also, you know, going back to an earlier thing, which is our conditioning as people, you know, when we're kids, we ask thousands of questions. There's one study I saw showed kids asking something like 40,000 questions between the ages of 2 and 5. So we're just like question machines at that age. And somewhere along the line, as we go into school and we get around other people and we get around authority figures and the teacher and so forth, there's a rapid decline in that asking of questions. And I think it has to do with peer pressure. I think it has to do with what we sense is rewarded and not rewarded. You know, when you're in school, you get rewarded for having the answer. You don't get rewarded for asking a question. Sometimes you're treated like an annoyance when you ask a question. So, you know, kids are picking up a lot of these signals, and the signal they're picking up is questions are not worth much. It's having the answers that's where the value is. That's where you're going to get rewarded. So all of this stuff is going on, and it's kind of forming an attitude we have toward questioning that by the time we get to be adults, you know, there's a sense that, gee, maybe questioning is not such a great thing. And then that gets reinforced sometimes in our workplaces, you know, where we may have a boss or a supervisor that is like, don't ask me those questions. I don't want to hear that. You know, that's a stupid question, or I don't have time for these questions. So if there's anything left in us by the time we get to a job, any of that curiosity or questioning left, it kind of gets, you know, beaten out of us at that point. So I think that's what's going on. And there's a little bit of a change in the air now. I think people are realizing what I'm detecting is, you know, I go around the business world a lot, and I think companies are realizing this is not a good thing. We need that curiosity from all our people, because we kind of need, you know, companies need the brain power of all their people. They really need to tap into it in order to be competitive. And if they're shutting down people's curiosity, if they're shutting down their ability to use their judgment, their ability to do critical thinking, if that stuff's all being shut down, then they're not getting the full benefit of that person. They're getting a half person, you know, and it's just not good. It's not good for the company. It's not good for the employee. It's not good for anybody. So I think there's starting to be an awareness now in organizations that, gee, maybe we should not be shutting down questioning. Maybe we should be trying to encourage it. And if we do that, if we try to do that, how can we do it? Are there ways that we could possibly set up, you know, practices or systems to do that?
Really, really good. And I appreciate you laying that down. One of the things I want to say about Warren's book for everybody is what's one of the many things that's great about it is he actually presents beautiful questions throughout the book, and he pivots between decision making and creativity, and leadership. But what I just want to give you an example. So Warren, what you were talking about here, when you were talking about how we tend to believe what we want to believe, and we get caught up in that, and then we gravitate to in groups that think like us and believe like us. What worries me about that is tribal behavior. Like I've spent my whole life working in tribal societies, and when we start to go into that in-group out-group dynamic, it can get very ugly very fast, you know, because then we start getting into fear-based behavior. We started getting into resource scarcity, status, and it gets very primal. And you know, that ability to bridge beyond our in-group and rally around things that are bigger than any one group, any one agenda, gets lost. We just close off to it. And so with that in mind, I'm just going to, so what, if you know, with Warren's book, he'll present you with questions that you can ask yourself. And like in this day and age, there's a couple of questions I'll just read here that I think we should all be asking ourselves right now. For example, is, you know, for example, on social injustice, what am I inclined to believe on this particular issue?
Right.
You know, why do I believe what I believe? And what would I like to be true? And what if the opposite were true? I mean, imagine, Warren, regardless of political affiliation or background or ethnicity, if every American asked themselves those 4 questions in a quiet place over a 24-hour period, honestly, with curiosity and discovery.
Yeah, it would be a huge shift for a lot of people, because they're not ever stepping back to look at their own mindset, if you will. They're not thinking about, where did these views come from?
Yeah.
What are they based on? Uh, how 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 do I know they're right? You know, and what is the opposite of that view? And what if I think about the merits of that opposite view? What if I try to explore that and think about what may be right or wrong within that view? So, what it's really about is getting ourselves to use this thing we have called critical thinking, right? Which is just so important for human beings. It's one of the things that really separates us and allows us to do amazing things is our critical thinking abilities. Without critical thinking, we really can't figure out what's true and false, and we can't solve problems, and there's a lot of stuff we can't do without critical thinking.
Yeah.
So,
And Warren, if
what
I
we
could,
need to do is use that tool and sharpen it as much as we can. And really, critical thinking, all it is, it's really just being willing to ask yourself questions that challenge your own instincts, because we all have instincts. We all have sort of opinions that we don't even know why they're there, or gut reactions. We all have gut reactions, you know. Now, gut reactions, sometimes they're right, but sometimes they're wrong. And we have to at least be willing to challenge and think about our own gut reactions. In the end, you may end up going with your gut reaction, but you
sure.
ought to be able to at least step back and ask yourself, why am I having this gut reaction? What
Well,
what might this
yeah.
gut reaction be based on? Might it be based on, the family I came from, the background I came from? Might it be based on some experience I went through that really kind of shaped me? And it's really good to know that, to know where those gut reactions are coming from, instead of just automatically, going with them. Say, I'm someone who just goes with my gut. I don't
Yeah.
question it. I don't think about it. I just go with my gut.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a big message, actually, that, for leaders, it's an important message for leaders, because I'm sure Scott, a lot of leaders are very into gut instinct, and they are absolutely convinced that they have a infallible gut, you know, and um, and some of them have pretty good instincts. It's true, but this is a false idea they've got in their head. This idea that they have an infallible gut, that they automatically know what's right and what's wrong in any situation, and that they can figure things out without any information. They just kind of go with whatever feels right, and they're right usually. That's kind of a false. That's a false story we tell ourselves, and it gets people into trouble. So I think, this idea that we need to use our critical thinking is so important as leaders, and just as people who are going to try to understand each other and get along with each other.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I've certainly worked for some of those leaders, and I think we're all guilty of it at times, right? So we all slip into that, and
Right.
and one of the things that I put in my latest book about leading through chaos, Warren, is I talk about this thing that I call emotional temperature, and so you have a sympathy. This is a temperature scale here, and you have a sympathetic state up here on the top with fight, flight, and freeze. And then you have that parasympathetic state down below, which is more like a calm and connect.
Mm.
And, the problem I'm seeing is that because we're such emotional creatures, everyone is getting over regulated, over amped, over aroused, and we're redlining in this sympathetic state all the time. We're
Yeah.
up here at this fight, flight, or freeze mode,
Right.
and and we're not even regulating our own emotional temperature to drop down into that parasympathetic state, and then have the leadership discipline of ourselves to ask the kind of questions and approach it the way you just suggested, because I
Yeah.
think it's kind of a 1-2 punch. It's that primal tendency that we have to elevate because of
Yeah.
all the distrust and other things happening. And then when that happens, we're not able to ask ourselves and hear those beautiful questions.
Yeah.
And
It's
that's dangerous.
I think I think a lot of it, that emotional and gut reaction stuff, it is primal, and it comes out of, there's some research that suggests it comes out of our time when we were, lived in the woods and had to deal with animals coming, and
Yeah.
threats coming at us very, very unexpectedly and very rapidly, and we had to make very quick snap judgments on, are we going to run away? Are we going to fight? What are we going to do? And obviously, in a military situation, sometimes people are still in that realm, of having to do those snap judgments and having danger that can come at you immediately. Um, but the everyday reality for most people is that they're not really facing those kinds of threats,
Exactly.
and they have the luxury of being able to think more about how they react to a situation, being able to take in more information, being able to lower the temperature. They don't have to fight or flight right away. They can kind of sort through the information and try to figure out, what's the best thing to do. So it's really a matter of, trying to move away from that gut reaction, that overly emotional reaction, and say to yourself, I'm a person with reason and intelligence, and I have a lot of information at my fingertips that I can use if I want to, and I don't have to make these, rash snap judgments and have these rash reactions to situations. I can do it differently if I work on it. Um, Now that's what I believe. I've had people say to me, from the world of psychology, that that is an overly optimistic view of humans, and that they cannot change their behavior, and that if they are prone
Hmm.
to, certain types of behavior like overreacting or not using their critical thinking, being too emotional, if they're prone to that, it's really, really hard to change because that's who they are and that's what they're all about. I don't really feel that way. I feel like everybody can change their behavior if they have the tools and the desire to do it. And so to me, that's one of the things in the book. You may have noticed I talk a lot about the fact that if you use questions as a tool, as your own tool, and you get used to it, you get used to saying, okay, every time I'm in a difficult situation, I'm going to ask myself these 3 questions or these 4 questions to try to slow things down and to try to see another point of view. I'm going to try to get myself in the habit of do that. In the beginning, I might have to carry a card around that has the 4 questions written down, but I'm going to do it, and until it becomes instinctive or habitual, and then I'll probably just ask those questions automatically in my head. So that's my belief, that you can do those kinds of techniques and tricks in order to modify your behavior so that you won't have these kinds of, rash behaviors and irrational reactions to things.
Yeah, I love that, and I do. I share your belief that that is something that we can each do both individually and organizationally. Why do you think, Warren, leaders avoid in some cases asking questions? I mean, we've established that they do. We've established that leaders who claim to have a great gut feel will go with that gut at all costs and shut people down. I see it all the time. And I do think you're right. I mean, I think there's a shift there, but there's still a lot of it where leaders are more inclined to not ask questions
Right.
oftentimes and just be declarative or prescriptive.
Yeah.
Why do you think that happens, and what can we call out on that to, so if leaders are watching this right now, maybe they can locate themselves there?
I think it's the way they were trained as leaders, because we, up until very recently, I think it may be changing now, but up until very recently, leaders were taught to behave a certain way. And they were taught that they are in charge. They need to project confidence. If they don't project confidence, people are not going to believe in them. They're not going to follow them. They're not going to be, and so the leader's not going to be successful. And they're taught that the way you project confidence is not by asking questions, it's by appearing to have the answers. It's by appearing to be very confident that you know what's going on, you have a handle on everything, and you're on top of it. So if you're trying to project that kind of an image, you can come to the conclusion that questions are your enemy, because number one, if you ask a question, you're going to be showing uncertainty and vulnerability, and you don't want to do that at any cost. And if someone else asks you a question, well, then that means they're challenging you. They're challenging your authority, and you don't like that either. So if you're all about authority, projecting confidence, you can get the impression that questions are not a good thing. And I think that's what is going on with a lot of leaders. Now, what I would say to them is, there's a couple of things that I think are wrong with that theory. So let's start with the fact that you don't have all the answers. Nobody does in this world. This sort of VUCA, the volatile, complex, uncertain environment. Nobody has all the answers. And a leader who tries to suggest that he does have all the answers is probably not going to project confidence. He's going to project the opposite, because at least among the fairly smart people that are in his organization, they're going to look at that and say, there's no way that this leader has all the answers. And I don't like the fact that he's claiming to have all the answers, because I know he doesn't. Yeah. So you're going to lose people's confidence rather than building it. And so that's the first thing, just that idea of, in this world, you need a little bit more humility as a leader. You really can't come out there with this, attitude of like, I know it all, don't worry, I've got it all figured out, and just do what I say and everything's going to be fine. That's really not going to fly for the most part in today's world, because people know better, and they're not going to fall for that. So that's one thing. Another thing is that leaders just don't realize maybe how powerful questions can be. They don't realize that they're so motivational. I think if they realized that, they would ask them more. They don't realize the effect they can have on people when you ask people a really big question like, hey folks, we have a big challenge here. How are we going to take this on? What are some of the things you think we could do to address this challenge we're facing? Leaders don't realize how empowering that is when you ask people those kinds of questions and you invite them to be part of the bigger solution.
Right.
It's hugely engaging for people, and it challenges them in a good way. So I think leaders just, it's starting to change now. Again, I was saying to you earlier, companies, there are companies bringing me in now, and it's the leaders who are bringing me in, and they're saying, look, I want more questioning in this company. I'm not sure how to do it, but I want more of it, and I want to be projecting that myself. I want to be projecting curiosity myself, and what are some of the ways I can do that? And I just think it's starting to change, but you're having to overcome a whole tradition, an old model of leadership that was really about command and control, right? So it was about, yeah, if you would just believe in command and control, then where does questioning fit in that? There's not much place for that.
That's really good. So we've got about 5 minutes left, Warren. I want to ask one more question. And I get this one a lot. Maybe you get it as well. It's a situational question, but I think just in you answering it, giving your perspective on it, there's a universal singular that folks can take away for a range of understanding other groups or not understanding them. I get asked all the time by a lot of CEOs and presidents and senior leaders. They're like, help me understand millennials. Right? I can't seem to collect them. If you got posed that question from a senior leader in a company who is struggling with that disparity, that connection gap, what are some of the things you might tell her that she could do using questions to bridge that gap?
I think that what you would need to do is, well, first of all, let's start with self-questioning. You know, it might be smart to self-question your premise. It might be smart to first start off saying, what are my biases on this issue? What do I believe about millennials going in, and where did that come from? All those ideas I have about millennials, how rooted is that in fact? And how much of it is just maybe stuff I've heard somewhere that I don't even know if it's valid or not. So I think it's always a good idea to challenge your assumptions going in. And that, I would say, with the millennials, you know, be sure to challenge the assumption first that they are this breed that has all these vastly different attitudes and they, you know, whatever. Just make sure you've sort of thought through the assumptions and the biases you might have toward them that might not be right. They might be flawed. And then I think what you're doing is reaching out the way you would to any other group. You're reaching out and asking them the kinds of questions, either individually or in groups. You're maybe asking them in groups. You know, what is it that you are hoping to achieve here? What do you see here that works in this organization, and what is it that you'd like to see done differently? And if you would like to see things done differently, how would you go about it?
Yeah.
How might you change a particular situation in this organization that you don't like? That's, by the way, a very effective thing to do, because it, you know, Scott, and we all know there's a lot of people in organizations, and millennials have a reputation for this, who complain. And you need to hear their complaints, but there's also value in challenging them to explore how they would do it differently, or what they think is the alternative approach, and force them to get out of the complaint mode and get into the problem solving mode. You know, you really want people to take on that responsibility, so they're not just going around griping all the time, but they're forced to take ownership of those gripes and say, okay, I can gripe all I want about this issue or this challenge, but what would I do differently? And do I understand the reasons why this policy exists in the first place? Have I thought about it? And have I thought through that if this policy was removed, what would we replace it with? So you almost want to challenge people to think that way and take ownership of maybe the problems they have, the issues they have with the old way of doing things. You know, one of the things that's said about millennials is that they don't like, they are challenging the existing ways of doing things. And that's a good thing. You know, that's good. We should welcome that. But we also want to push them to do more than just complain about it or to say it's no good, but to challenge them to say, okay, how are we going to improve the old system? You want to improve it. Let's talk about some of the ways we could do that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think millennials also asking themselves questions about what from, you know, that generation should we keep and preserve, what's worth preserving, you know,
Right.
and I think your point that if everybody asked themselves questions first about their own biases, their own beliefs, I mean, wow, what a game changer that would be. Another thing that you've taught as I wrap it too, is you've helped me learn to frame questions in a more thoughtful way. Like as I was listening to you talk, one question that I've coached business executives to say is very specifically as they walk the halls and they sit down with a junior associate is, okay, you've got my job right now until 5 p.m. today. What are the first 3 things you're going to do before lunch that you're going to change?
Right.
You know?
Right.
And it's amazing that some of the answers they get, like it's really helpful stuff.
It's
I mean,
very helpful
because they're in the trenches.
I'll give you one suggestion I often give people about those kinds of questions. Those are great questions to ask. Um, don't necessarily expect or force people to answer them on the spot,
Right.
because they are
Okay.
such
Great.
challenging questions that if you really want to get a good answer on them, give people a chance, ask the question and then come back later,
Well,
because
that is gold.
give people a chance to think about it, because a lot of times when you ask someone a really ambitious, powerful question, they can't answer it on the spot, or they freeze, and so you
Wow.
want to give them a chance to sort of go home, think about that, and that's when you'll really get their best thinking. That's when you'll get them coming back to you and saying, I thought
Man.
about what you asked, and here's what I think, and then you're going to get something kind of deep.
Wow, I really love that, and that is the pure gold. That I hope everybody heard that one, because I mean I've been guilty of that. Is I'll ask what I feel is a powerful question, and I'll lean in for that response and get some good stuff. But I've never thought about even prefacing it with, like, you know what, I'm going to come back tomorrow and give you some time. I'm going to give you some time to stew on that,
Right.
and I'd really appreciate your answer. I mean, that's almost more validation of them
Yeah.
by giving them time to reflect on it.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. Well, look, Warren, I want to kind of wrap it here. Just a couple of things I want to highlight that you brought up tonight about beautiful questions, being ambitious and actionable, and potentially game changing. Also highlighting that it's one of the fastest ways in the world to build trust. And really, if we heard anything tonight, is to start with the questions we ask ourselves. And so many more times that's going to lead to better questions that we ask others. Warren, is there anything about questionology, and particularly in the times that we're in, that we didn't talk about tonight, that's an absolute must that you'd want to put out there for leaders as they're watching this?
Just to say two things I'd say to leaders. I always say this is kind of a provocative idea, but think about whether your mission statement might work better as a mission question. Just an idea to toy with. And the reason you might want to toy with that is just because questions can be more engaging and more inviting to people, and they're more like a mission, because they're open-ended. A statement usually sounds like something we've done already. So if you want your mission statement to feel like it's inviting people on a mission, think about whether you could retool it and rephrase it as a mission question instead of a mission statement. And the only other thing I'd say is just going back to some of what we talked earlier in terms of interactions between people. There's a great line I heard from a playwright, and she said when she's interacting with people and trying to learn from them, she always tries to replace judgment with curiosity. So any chance you get to replace judgment with curiosity will help you to be a better questioner.
Wow, that is so good. Did you get that, Mark? All right. Warren, what are you doing next? What are you up to, and how do we stay in touch with you?
Well, I've got my website, amorebeautifulquestion.com. That's, I invite people to go there. There's a lot of stuff you can learn about questioning and quizzes you can take. And I even have a list of all the songs that are questions for a title and all kinds of stuff. So it's just a questioning kind of warehouse of all kinds of question related things. So I recommend people go to amorebeautifulquestion.com. And then as far as what I'm working on, I'm just, continuing to, my latest book, which just came out, is geared to classrooms, and how do we bring more questioning into classrooms, and what can teachers do to get students to ask more questions. So that's the latest thing I'm kind of focused on right now, is the education world. Yeah, that's about it.
Wow, I love that. Well, look, I just want to thank you personally for all the work that you've done, Warren, to open up the field of questionology. I mean, you say it's a made up word. I personally think it's a super bold thing to do. It's a super generous thing to do. And, I mean, there are quite a few of us out there who really are grateful for you doing that. And because we're operating in some worlds where if we do this better, it can save lives, and it can help us represent better, and do our job more more ethically. And
Yeah.
I think in a way that's more servant oriented. So, I mean, I'm just really grateful. And I think we need it in this day and age,
Yeah, I agree.
the field of questionology. So I'm grateful to you for that. I would encourage anybody watching this, if you haven't picked up this book right here, The Book of Beautiful Questions, it is jammed. You can see how scuffed up it is. I've got Post-it notes in here. I mean, I carry it in my pack, but it has helped us transform what we're doing in special operations, in a lot of the areas I work in human connection in the business world. And I don't care what you do for a living. If you lead people, your family, your community, your school, your business, this is an approach that it will change everything. So I highly recommend you pick it up. Warren, thank you so much. I hope you'll come on again sometime and be part of our rooftop community. It's just great having you
Anytime,
in
Scott. It was a really great conversation. And by the way, you asked great questions.
Thank you. They're coming from you, man. I'll take it. So thanks again. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you in our next installment of Rooftop Leadership.